My husband said he was visiting his dying grandmother every weekend. 6 months into our marriage, I discovered she'd been dead for 3 years. He was actually visiting his pregnant ex-girlfriend in prison. Within months, he joined her there. My name is Emily, and if someone had told me a year ago that I'd be the star of my own crime drama, I would have laughed in their face. I was a 32-year-old marketing manager with a sensible apartment, a reliable car, and what I thought was a perfectly normal marriage to Daniel, a successful attorney. Unfortunately, normal isn't quite the word I'd use anymore. Daniel was everything I thought I wanted in a husband. Charming, successful, well-dressed, and he had this way of making me feel like the most important person in the room. He was 36, established in his law practice, and seemed refreshingly mature after years of dating men who thought commitment meant remembering my birthday. We met on a dating app, which should have been my first clue that something wasn't quite right. Not because there's anything wrong with online dating, mind you, but because his profile was almost too perfect. Professional photos, articulate responses, no obvious red flags. In hindsight, it was like a carefully crafted marketing campaign, which, as it turns out, it basically was. Our courtship was what romance novels would call whirlwind, 3 months from first date to wedding day. Claire, my best friend and the voice of reason I consistently ignored, kept asking why we were rushing. "When you know," I'd tell her with the confidence of someone who clearly didn't know anything at all. Daniel had this way of making everything feel urgent and romantic. "Life's too short to wait when you found your person," he'd say, and I'd melt like chocolate in a hot car. The wedding was beautiful, intimate, and expensive. Mostly paid for by me, though Daniel assured me he'd reimburse me once some client payments came through. Those payments, unsurprisingly, never materialized. But by then we were married, and it seemed petty to keep track. After all, what's his is mine, and what's mine is his, right? Well, as I'd soon discover, Daniel took that philosophy very literally when it came to the "what's mine is his" part. The first few months of marriage felt like an extended honeymoon. Daniel was attentive, romantic, and seemed genuinely excited about building our life together. There was just one tiny detail that struck me as odd. I had never met a single member of his family. Not one. When I'd ask about it, he'd get this sad, distant look and explain that his family was complicated. His parents had died in a car accident when he was young, he'd tell me, and he'd been raised by his grandmother, Helen Park. She was elderly now, he explained, and quite traditional. "She needs time to warm up to new people," he'd say, "especially women I'm serious about. She's very protective of me." It seemed sweet, actually. A grandmother who loved her grandson so much she was cautious about the women in his life. I imagined a tiny, fierce Korean woman who'd raised Daniel with strict values and high expectations. I looked forward to eventually winning her over with my charm and homemade cookies. What I didn't realize was that I was more likely to win over a ghost, which would have been considerably easier and far less expensive. Every weekend, without fail, Daniel would pack an overnight bag and head off to visit Grandma Helen. "She's not doing well," he'd say with convincing concern. "The doctors think it might be time to start considering options." He'd let that hang in the air with just the right amount of gravitas. I'd offer to come along, to help care for her, or just to finally meet this important woman in his life. But Daniel always had a reason why that wouldn't work. "She's having a bad day," he'd say, or "she's too weak for visitors right now." My personal favorite was, "She specifically asked for just family this weekend," which was particularly creative since I was, technically, family now, but I was understanding. I was supportive. I was, as it turns out, completely clueless. 6 months into our marriage, I decided to plan something special for our anniversary. I'd noticed Daniel seemed stressed lately, more phone calls taken in private, more time spent in his locked home office, more weekend trips to see Grandma Helen. I thought a romantic evening at home might be just what we needed. I bought steaks, expensive wine, and even splurged on those ridiculously overpriced candles that supposedly smell like Mediterranean breeze. but mostly just smell like someone set a fruit salad on fire. I spent the entire day preparing. I cleaned the house until it sparkled, arranged flowers, set the dining room table with our wedding china, and slow-cooked the steaks to perfection. I even wore the dress Daniel had complimented on our first date. Navy blue with tiny white flowers. Conservative enough for a first date, but pretty enough to make me feel special. I was ready to celebrate 6 months of what I believed was wedded bliss. Daniel was supposed to be home by 7. At 7:15, my phone rang. "Hey, babe," he said, and I could immediately hear the apologetic tone that meant my evening was about to be ruined. "I'm so sorry, but Grandma Helen had another episode. I'm on my way to the hospital right now." I looked at the table I'd spent an hour setting, at the steaks that were perfectly medium rare, at the candles that were filling our dining room with the allegedly Mediterranean breeze. "Is she okay?" I asked, because that's what a good wife asks, even when her anniversary dinner is currently congealing on bone china. "She's stable, but the doctors want to keep her overnight for observation. I need to stay with her. You know how scared she gets in hospitals." Of course I knew, except I didn't know anything about Grandma Helen except what Daniel had told me, which, as I'd later discover, was about as reliable as a weather forecast in tornado season. "Should I come to the hospital?" I offered. "I could bring you some food, keep you company." No, Daniel said quickly. "Hospital visiting hours are almost over anyway, and you know how she feels about meeting new people when she's stressed. Rain check on dinner? We'll celebrate this weekend, I promise." I ate dinner alone, drank most of the expensive wine by myself, and went to bed wondering why, after 6 months of marriage, I still felt like I was dating someone who was perpetually unavailable. Claire had been asking pointed questions about Daniel's family situation for months. "It's just weird that you haven't met her yet," she'd say. "I mean, you're married to her grandson. How traditional can she be?" I'd defend him, naturally. "She's elderly, Claire. She's set in her ways. These things take time." But sitting there alone on our anniversary, picking at a gourmet meal while my husband comforted a woman I'd never met, I started to wonder if Claire might have a point. The weekend trip to visit Grandma Helen had become such a regular occurrence that I'd stopped even asking when he'd be back. Every Friday evening, Daniel would pack his small travel bag with the efficiency of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. He'd kiss me goodbye, promise to call when he got there safely, and off he'd go to tend to his ailing grandmother. He was such a devoted grandson, I thought, so responsible, so caring. It was one of the things I loved about him, his commitment to family. What I didn't love was the growing pressure he'd started putting on me about starting our own family. About 2 months after the anniversary disaster, Daniel had come home from one of his grandmother visits with a bag from the pharmacy. He set it on the kitchen counter with the casual air of someone who'd just bought milk and bread. "What's this?" I asked, opening the bag to find prenatal vitamins, folic acid supplements, and a fertility tracking kit that looked complicated enough to require an engineering degree. "I was talking to Grandma Helen about our future," he said, wrapping his arms around me from behind. "She's so excited about the possibility of a great-grandchild. She keeps asking when we're going to give her one." The pressure was subtle, but constant. Comments about how we're not getting any younger, and Grandma Helen might not have much time left. He'd bring up friends who were pregnant, point out babies in restaurants, and somehow work the topic of our future children into nearly every conversation. When I suggested we might want to wait a year or two, get more settled in our marriage first, he'd get this hurt look. "Don't you want kids?" he'd ask. "I thought you wanted a family. Grandma Helen is so looking forward to meeting her great-grandchild before—" He'd trail off dramatically, letting the implication hang in the air. The elderly grandmother clinging to life, hoping to hold her grandson's baby before she passed away. It was emotional manipulation so skillful it could have been taught in masterclass format. I started taking the prenatal vitamins, more to stop the conversations than because I was ready to get pregnant. Something about the whole situation felt rushed, pressured, not quite right. But Daniel was my husband, and he seemed so excited about the prospect of starting our family. I told myself I was being paranoid, that he was just enthusiastic about our future together. Looking back, I realized the pressure to get pregnant quickly had nothing to do with his excitement about fatherhood and everything to do with trapping me before I discovered the truth. A pregnant wife is considerably less likely to leave when she finds out her husband is a lying, cheating, stealing con artist. Unfortunately for Daniel, I was apparently too slow on the uptake to fall into that particular trap before his whole elaborate scheme started unraveling. The unraveling began, appropriately enough, with Google. It was a Sunday morning, 3 days after Daniel had missed yet another dinner we'd planned because of Grandma Helen's emergency. I was drinking coffee and feeling sorry for myself when I decided to do something I should have done months earlier. I Googled his grandmother. It seemed like such a reasonable thing to do. Helen Park, elderly Korean woman, probably in her 80s or 90s if she'd raised Daniel from childhood. I was thinking I might find her obituary someday and wanted to know more about this important person in my husband's life. Maybe I could find information about her younger years, her immigration story, something that would help me connect with her when we finally met. I typed Helen Park obituary into the search bar, expecting to find nothing or maybe an unrelated person with the same name. What I found instead was exactly what I was looking for, and absolutely the last thing I wanted to see. Helen Park, age 87, beloved mother and grandmother, had passed away peacefully in her sleep 3 years ago. 3 years. The obituary was detailed, complete with a photo that matched the woman in the framed picture Daniel kept on his dresser. The woman I'd been hearing about for 6 months, the woman whose declining health had been the reason for countless missed dinners and canceled plans. The woman Daniel visited religiously every weekend had been dead since before we'd even met. I sat there staring at my laptop screen, reading the obituary over and over, as if the words might somehow rearrange themselves into something that made sense. I checked the date again. Definitely 3 years ago. I looked at the photo again. Definitely the same woman from Daniel's picture. I searched for other Helen Parks, thinking maybe this was a different person. Maybe there were 2 elderly Korean women with the same name in the same area. But no, the obituary mentioned her surviving grandson, Daniel Park, who worked as an attorney in the city. My husband had been lying to me. Not just lying, creating an elaborate fiction about a dead woman to cover up. What exactly? Where was he going every weekend? What was he doing that required such an intricate deception? I closed the laptop and sat in my kitchen, drinking coffee that had gone cold while I tried to process what I'd discovered. Daniel was supposed to be visiting his grandmother's grave, I told myself. Maybe he was just too grief-stricken to tell me she was dead. Maybe he visited her grave every weekend and couldn't bear to admit she was gone. But even as I tried to rationalize it, I knew that didn't make sense. You don't pack an overnight bag to visit a cemetery. You don't get emergency phone calls from dead people. And you certainly don't receive updates about a corpse's medical condition from hospital staff. No, Daniel was lying about where he went every weekend, and he was using his dead grandmother as cover. The question was, what was he really doing? I spent the rest of that Sunday in a state of shock, going through the motions of normal life while my mind raced through possibilities. Was he having an affair? Was he gambling? Did he have some kind of addiction he was hiding? Whatever it was, it required him to be gone overnight every weekend for the past 6 months, and it was important enough to construct an elaborate lie involving a fictitious dying grandmother. When Daniel came home that evening, rolling his small suitcase behind him and wearing the same slightly sad expression he always had after visiting Grandma Helen, I found myself studying his face like I'd never seen him before. How had I never noticed that his grief seemed performative? How had I never questioned why his weekend visits never seemed to actually improve his grandmother's condition? "How's Grandma Helen?" I asked, my voice carefully neutral. "Not good," he said, shaking his head with practiced sorrow. "The doctors are concerned about her breathing. They might need to put her on oxygen full time." He was so convincing, so believable. If I hadn't seen the obituary with my own eyes, I would have felt sorry for him. Instead, I felt sick. That night, lying in bed next to my husband while he slept peacefully, I made a decision. I wasn't going to confront him yet. I wasn't going to let him know that I knew he was lying. Instead, I was going to figure out exactly what he was hiding before I said a word. I was going to investigate my own husband like he was a criminal, which, as it turned out, wasn't that far from the truth. The next morning, I started my investigation with all the subtlety of a private detective in a 1940s film noir. While Daniel was in the shower, I went through his jacket pockets like a woman possessed. I felt ridiculous. Here I was, a grown woman rifling through her husband's clothes like a suspicious teenager. But desperate times call for desperate measures, and discovering your spouse has been lying about visiting a dead person definitely qualifies as desperate times. What I found in those pockets was more illuminating than a forensic accounting course. Gas station receipts, all from the same road, all purchased on weekend mornings for the past 6 months. The interesting thing about these receipts wasn't just their consistency, it was their direction. Daniel had told me his grandmother lived about an hour north of the city. These receipts mapped out a route heading southeast, toward a town called Greenville that I'd never heard of, and definitely never associated with elderly Korean grandmothers. Then there were the hotel receipts. Not exactly what you'd expect from someone spending weekends caring for a sick relative, unless Grandma Helen lived in a Hampton Inn. The receipts were all from the same hotel, the Greenville Suites, apparently Daniel's weekend home away from home. One-night stays every weekend for months. Either his grandmother lived in a hotel, which seemed unlikely, or Daniel was staying overnight somewhere else entirely after doing whatever he was actually doing in Greenville. But the most interesting discovery was a series of ATM receipts for exactly $200, withdrawn every Friday afternoon from a bank branch in Greenville. $200 like clockwork every single week. That seemed like an oddly specific amount for general weekend expenses. It was enough to be significant, but not so much that it would show up as suspicious on our joint bank statements. If I hadn't been specifically looking for it, I probably would never have noticed. I spread all the receipts out on our kitchen table like evidence in a crime scene, which I suppose they were. Gas station, hotel, ATM withdrawal, gas station, hotel, ATM withdrawal. The pattern was so consistent it was almost boring. Daniel had a routine, and whatever he was doing in Greenville, it required overnight accommodations and exactly $200 in cash every week. Now I needed to figure out what was in Greenville that would require such dedication and financial commitment. A quick Google search revealed that Greenville was a small town about 2 hours southeast of the city, population roughly 15,000. It had a downtown area with the usual collection of restaurants and shops, a small college, and apparently very little else of note. Certainly nothing that screamed weekend destination for lying husbands. But then I dug a little deeper and found something interesting. Greenville was home to the Greenville Women's Correctional Facility, a medium-security prison that housed about 800 female inmates. The prison's visiting hours were Saturday and Sunday, 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. Visitors were allowed to deposit up to $200 per visit into inmates' commissary accounts. Suddenly, Daniel's weekend routine made perfect sense, and absolutely no sense at all. My husband was visiting someone in prison every weekend for 6 months, someone important enough to him that he'd constructed an elaborate lie about a dead grandmother to cover his tracks, someone he was financially supporting to the tune of $200 a week, plus hotel costs and gas. I sat in my kitchen, surrounded by receipts that painted a picture I really didn't want to see, and tried to process this new information. The optimistic part of my brain suggested maybe Daniel was doing volunteer work at the prison. Maybe he was providing legal services to inmates who couldn't afford representation. Maybe this was all perfectly innocent, and he just hadn't told me because he was modest about his charitable work. The realistic part of my brain, unfortunately, had other ideas. I needed more information, and I knew exactly where to find it. Daniel's home office had been off limits since we'd moved in together. Client confidentiality, he'd explain whenever I asked about it. I can't risk having sensitive legal documents accessible to anyone else. The room stayed locked, and Daniel kept the key on his key ring at all times. It was, he'd told me, standard practice for attorneys who worked from home. I'd accepted this explanation because it seemed reasonable. Lawyers handle confidential information. Of course, he'd need a secure space to work. But now I was wondering what kind of confidential information required quite so much security. After all, most attorneys manage to practice law without turning their homes into fortress. Breaking into my husband's office wasn't exactly high on my list of life goals. But then again, neither was being married to someone who lied about visiting dead people. I waited until Daniel left for work on Tuesday morning, then set about gaining access to his sanctuary with all the skill of someone who'd watched exactly 0 heist movies and had no idea what she was doing. The lock wasn't particularly sophisticated, just a standard door handle with a keyed lock. I started with a bobby pin, because that's what people do in movies, but quickly discovered that real-life locks are significantly less cooperative than their cinematic counterparts. After 15 minutes of accomplishing nothing except bending several bobby pins into abstract art, I tried a credit card. This also failed spectacularly, though I did manage to give myself a paper cut from a plastic card, which seemed like it should be physically impossible. Finally, in a moment of inspiration or desperation, I remembered the spare key Daniel kept hidden under our bedroom dresser for emergencies. It wasn't the office key, but it looked similar enough that I wondered if Daniel might have used the same key for multiple locks. This turned out to be exactly the kind of security oversight you'd expect from someone who thought using a dead grandmother as an alibi was foolproof. The key worked. Daniel's office was exactly what you'd expect from a successful attorney. Impressive diplomas on the walls, law books arranged with mathematical precision, and a desk that probably cost more than most people's cars. Everything was organized to the point of obsession, which made the locked drawer in his desk stand out like a neon sign advertising, "Secrets hidden here." The drawer was locked, naturally, because apparently Daniel believed in the Russian nesting doll approach to security. But I was getting better at this breaking and entering thing, and I found the key taped to the underside of the desk drawer like I was following a treasure map written by someone with no imagination. Inside the locked drawer, inside the locked office, inside our shared home, I found a folder labeled simply V. The folder contained approximately 24 photographs of Daniel with a strikingly beautiful woman who definitely wasn't me. They looked happy together, really genuinely happy in a way that made my stomach clench. The photos spanned what looked like several years, from casual snapshots to formal events, and in every single one, they looked like a couple deeply in love. Under the photos were prison visitation forms, 26 weeks' worth of forms requesting permission to visit Vanessa Chen, inmate number 847392, at the Greenville Women's Correctional Facility, every weekend for the past 6 months, documented in triplicate. Below the visitation forms were money transfer receipts showing $2,000 monthly deposits into Vanessa's prison commissary account, plus the weekly $200 cash deposits I'd already discovered. Daniel wasn't just visiting someone in prison, he was financially supporting her to the tune of about $30,000 a year. But the most devastating discovery was a stack of letters written on prison stationery, all signed, "Forever yours, V." I shouldn't have read them. I should have closed the folder, put everything back exactly as I'd found it, and pretended I'd never seen any of it. But curiosity killed more than cats, and I was apparently determined to murder every last bit of naivety I had left. The letters were love letters, not friendly correspondence, not legal consultation, not charitable support for a disadvantaged inmate. These were passionate, intimate letters from a woman who was clearly in love with my husband and expected that love to be returned. She wrote about missing him, about counting the days until her release, about their future together. She referenced shared memories, inside jokes, promises he'd made to her. "I know this is hard," one letter read, "being apart for so long, but it's only temporary. When I get out, We can finally be together the way we always planned. Thank you for never giving up on me, for standing by me through everything. I love you more than words can express." Another letter was even more explicit about their future plans. "Only 18 months left, my love. 18 months, and then we can start our real life together. I can't wait to be Mrs. Daniel Park. I can't wait to give you the children we've always talked about." Mrs. Daniel Park, the children they'd always talked about. I was reading love letters from my husband's girlfriend, a woman who was planning to marry him and have his children just as soon as she got out of prison. A woman who had no idea that Daniel was already married to someone else. Unless she did know. Unless I wasn't the wife in this scenario. Unless I was the other woman. I kept reading, even though every word felt like a small knife to the heart. The letters painted a picture of a relationship that had lasted for years, a deep and committed love that had survived whatever had landed Vanessa in prison. She wrote about their past together, their shared dreams, their unshakable bond. She thanked him for paying for her appeals, for supporting her financially, for visiting her every single week without fail. "You're the only good thing in my life," she wrote. "The only reason I can get through each day in this place. Knowing you're out there, waiting for me, loving me. It's what keeps me going." At the bottom of the pile was a newspaper clipping that explained how Vanessa had ended up in the Greenville Women's Correctional Facility. The headline read, "Local Woman Sentenced in Elderly Fraud Scheme." The article described how Vanessa Chen had systematically defrauded elderly victims out of over $300,000 through a sophisticated identity theft and financial exploitation scheme. She'd targeted seniors, gained their trust, and then stolen their life savings. She'd been sentenced to 5 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 3.5 years. The article mentioned that Vanessa's boyfriend, Daniel Park, had stood by her throughout the trial and sentencing. There was even a quote from Daniel. "Vanessa made some mistakes, but she's a good person who deserves a second chance. I'll be here for her no matter what." The article was dated 3.5 years ago, just a few months before Daniel's dating profile had gone active, just a few months before he'd started his campaign to find a new source of income to support his imprisoned girlfriend. I sat in Daniel's chair, in his locked office, holding evidence of a relationship that predated our marriage by years and was apparently intended to continue long after I'd been discarded. I wasn't his wife. I was his temporary solution to a financial problem. I was the mark in a long con designed to fund his real relationship with his real love, who just happened to be serving time for stealing money from elderly people. The irony wasn't lost on me. Daniel was stealing money from me to support a woman who'd been convicted of stealing money from other people. It was like a criminal pyramid scheme, with me at the bottom, funding the whole operation. But as devastating as this discovery was, it wasn't the worst thing I found in that folder. At the very bottom, underneath all the photos and letters and legal documents, was a single sheet of paper that made everything else look like a minor betrayal. It was a medical authorization form from the Greenville Correctional Medical Facility, dated just 3 months earlier. The form authorized artificial insemination services for inmate Vanessa Chen, with Daniel Park listed as the biological father. Below that was a payment receipt for $3,500 and a note in Vanessa's handwriting. "Our baby due in 3 months. When I get out in 6 months, we can finally start our real life together. Love you forever." Daniel and Vanessa were having a baby together while married to me. They'd planned this pregnancy, paid for it, and were counting down the days until they could be a family together. And suddenly, Daniel's pressure for me to get pregnant immediately made perfect, horrible sense. He wanted me pregnant so I'd be trapped when Vanessa got out of prison and his real life began. I checked the date on the fertility authorization form again, then pulled up the calendar on my phone to confirm what I already suspected. March 15th. The same day I'd miscarried the baby Daniel and I had been trying to conceive. I remembered that day with crystal clarity. I'd woken up cramping and bleeding, terrified and alone. I'd called Daniel in a panic, begging him to meet me at the hospital. "I'm in a critical deposition," he'd told me. "I can't leave right now. Can you call Claire to drive you?" I'd lost our baby alone, with only a kind nurse for comfort. Daniel had shown up 4 hours later, apologetic but oddly detached. "These things happen," he'd said. "We can try again." Now I knew why he couldn't come to the hospital. He wasn't in a deposition. He was at the prison fertility clinic, creating a baby with another woman while I lost his child alone. The betrayal was so complete, so calculated, that I actually felt impressed by the sheer audacity of it. While I was grieving the loss of our pregnancy, Daniel was celebrating the beginning of his real family with his real love. It was sociopathic in its precision. I sat in that office for what felt like hours, holding the medical authorization form and trying to process what I'd discovered. My husband was a con artist. I was his mark. Our entire marriage was a carefully orchestrated scam designed to fund his relationship with a convicted felon who was carrying his child. It was like discovering you'd been living in a soap opera, except soap operas have better writers and more believable plot lines. Eventually, I managed to put everything back exactly as I'd found it and lock the office behind me. I stumbled to the living room and collapsed on our couch. The couch Daniel had insisted we buy with my credit card because his was temporarily maxed out. I stared at the ceiling and tried to figure out what to do with information that had basically nuked my entire understanding of my life. My first instinct was to call Daniel and confront him immediately, to scream and cry and demand explanations for the unexplainable. But something stopped me. Maybe it was self-preservation. Maybe it was the growing realization that I was dealing with someone far more dangerous than I'd ever imagined. A man who could lie about visiting a dead grandmother for 6 months while creating a baby with his imprisoned girlfriend wasn't someone you confronted without a plan. Instead, I called Claire. Claire Hudson was my best friend, and more importantly for this particular crisis, a fraud investigator for a major insurance company. If anyone would know how to handle discovering your spouse was a lying, cheating criminal, it would be Claire. She also had the distinction of being the only person who'd openly questioned Daniel from the beginning, which made her either psychic or significantly more observant than me. "Emily?" Claire answered on the first ring. "You sound terrible. What's wrong?" "I need you to come over," I said, surprised by how calm my voice sounded. "And bring your laptop. I think I married a criminal." Claire, to her credit, didn't ask questions. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. When Claire arrived, she took one look at my face and immediately went to my kitchen to make coffee. "Okay," she said, settling onto the couch beside me with 2 steaming mugs. "Start from the beginning and tell me everything." So I did. I told her about the grandmother who'd been dead for 3 years, about the prison visits, about Vanessa and the love letters and the baby that was due in 3 months. I showed her printouts I'd made of the obituary, the receipts I'd found, and photos I'd taken of the documents in Daniel's office. By the time I finished, Claire was staring at me with the same expression I imagine people have when they witness car accidents. "Emily," she said slowly, "this isn't just cheating. This is a comprehensive fraud operation. You're not his wife. You're his victim." "I know," I said, and saying it out loud made it real in a way that thinking it hadn't. "The question is, what do I do about it?" Claire opened her laptop and started typing. "First, we figure out exactly how much he's stolen from you. Because if he's supporting Vanessa to the tune of $30,000 a year, plus paying for fertility treatments and God knows what else, that money is coming from somewhere. And I'm betting it's coming from you." For the next 2 hours, Claire walked me through a financial forensic investigation that made my earlier detective work look like child's play. We logged into every account I had access to, pulled credit reports, and requested official copies of all my financial documents from the bank. What we discovered was even worse than I'd feared. Over the past 6 months, $85,000 had mysteriously disappeared from my savings account. Not all at once, which might have triggered alerts, but in careful increments that had been small enough to avoid notice. $5,000 here, $3,000 there. Amounts that could be explained as normal married couple expenses if anyone had bothered to look closely. But Claire was looking very closely indeed, and what she found was a systematic pattern of theft that had been going on since our honeymoon. Every transfer corresponded to either a prison deposit, a payment to Vanessa's legal defense fund, or a deposit into an account I'd never seen before that was apparently Daniel's personal slush fund. "He's been using your money to fund his entire double life," Claire said, pulling up bank records on her laptop. "Look at this. Every time you got a bonus at work, there's a corresponding transfer out of your account within days. He's been monitoring your income and skimming off the top." The audacity was breathtaking. Daniel had been stealing my money so systematically that he'd turned it into a science. He knew when I got paid, he knew when I received unexpected income, and he'd developed a system for taking just enough to fund his prison girlfriend without taking so much that I'd notice. It was like having a financial vampire attached to my bank account. But the stolen savings were just the beginning. When the official documents arrived from the bank 2 days later, Claire spread them across my dining room table with the grim satisfaction of someone who'd expected bad news and gotten it in abundance. "Emily," she said, pointing to a stack of loan applications, "do you remember signing any of these?" I looked at the papers she was showing me. Loan applications, mortgage documents, credit card agreements, all with my signature, all approved, all for substantial amounts of money. A second mortgage on my house for $120,000. A loan against my inherited investments for $60,000. Credit cards I'd never opened carrying balances of $35,000. A personal loan using my parents' inheritance as collateral for $25,000. "I never signed any of these," I said, studying what was supposed to be my signature. It looked like my handwriting, but I had absolutely no memory of signing any loan documents. "That's because you didn't sign them," Claire said grimly. "Look at the dates. Every single one of these was processed while you were at work or out of town. Daniel forged your signature and used your financial information to take out loans in your name." The total was staggering. Over $240,000 in fraudulent loans, all secured using my credit, my house, and my inherited assets as collateral. Money I never saw, money I never authorized, money that was apparently funding Daniel's elaborate con game. "Where did all this money go?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. Claire pulled up more documents. Legal defense funds for Vanessa's appeals, the fertility clinic where they made their baby, and look at this. She showed me a bank statement for an account in Daniel's name. He's been depositing the loan money here and then transferring it out to various accounts. Prison commissary, legal fees, and what looks like a savings account for when Vanessa gets out. I was looking at evidence that my husband had stolen nearly $250,000 from me to fund his relationship with another woman. He'd forged my signature, used my credit, and leveraged my assets to pay for his girlfriend's legal fees and their future together. I was financing my own betrayal. "There's more," Claire said, and I wondered how there could possibly be more. I ran a background check on Daniel's dating history. She showed me what she'd found. Daniel's online dating profile had gone active exactly 1 week after Vanessa's sentencing. His profile had been specifically designed to attract successful, financially stable women, professional photos, carefully crafted responses, emphasizing his desire for commitment and family. The profile that had attracted me was basically a fishing net designed to catch financially viable victims. "He was targeting women with assets," Claire explained. "Look at the messaging patterns. He pursued at least 6 different women before you, all successful professionals with substantial savings or inherited wealth. You weren't randomly selected, Emily. You were specifically chosen because you fit his victim profile." The timeline was damning. Daniel had started looking for a wife the week Vanessa was sentenced to prison. He'd pursued multiple wealthy women until he found one naive enough to marry him quickly. Our whirlwind romance wasn't romantic. It was a con artist working on a deadline. He needed to get married and start draining assets before Vanessa's release date. "How long do I have?" I asked. Claire checked her notes. "Vanessa's eligible for parole in 3 months. Based on the patterns I'm seeing, Daniel's plan was probably to divorce you right before her release, take whatever he could in the settlement, and start his new life with her and their baby." 3 months. I had 3 months before Daniel disappeared with my money, my assets, and my future. 3 months before he abandoned me for the life he'd always intended to have with Vanessa. But now I knew about his plan. And unlike Daniel, I wasn't going to underestimate my opponent. "Claire," I said, "I need a lawyer, the kind who specializes in making criminals pay for their crimes." Claire smiled for the first time since she'd arrived. "I know exactly who to call." The lawyer Claire recommended was Sarah Kim, a woman in her 50s who specialized in financial fraud and elder abuse cases. "Though you're not elderly," Sarah clarified during our first meeting, "what Daniel has done to you fits the same pattern as financial exploitation. He identified a target, gained their trust, and systematically stole their assets while maintaining the facade of a caring relationship." Sarah's office was exactly what you'd expect from an attorney who spent her days dealing with con artists and criminals. Diplomas and awards covering the walls, law books that looked actually used rather than decorative, and a no-nonsense attitude that made me feel like I'd finally found someone who could fight Daniel at his own game. "The good news," Sarah said, reviewing the evidence Claire and I had compiled, "is that you have an excellent case. Multiple counts of identity theft, forgery, wire fraud, and grand larceny. The bad news is that if we don't act quickly, Daniel might realize you've discovered his scheme and try to disappear with whatever assets he can access." Sarah explained that we needed to move fast on multiple fronts. First, we'd file for emergency legal protections to freeze all joint accounts and prevent Daniel from selling or transferring any assets. Second, we'd build a criminal case with the help of law enforcement. Third, we'd prepare for the inevitable confrontation when Daniel realized his con game was over. "The key," Sarah said, "is to get him to confess before he lawyers up. Con artists are typically arrogant enough to believe they can talk their way out of anything. If we can get him on record admitting to the fraud, the criminal case becomes much stronger." She explained her plan. We'd set up all the legal protections first, freezing accounts, securing the house, protecting my credit. Then we'd arrange for me to wear a wire during a confrontation with Daniel. The goal was to get him to admit to forging documents, stealing money, and lying about his motives for marrying me. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" Sarah asked. Confronting a con artist can be emotionally devastating. They're skilled at manipulation, and he'll probably try to turn this around and make you feel like you're the one who's done something wrong. I thought about the fertility clinic receipt dated the same day I'd miscarried. I thought about the love letters from Vanessa planning their future together. I thought about $240,000 stolen to fund a relationship with a convicted felon while I believed I was building a life with someone who loved me. "I'm ready," I said. "He destroyed my life for money. Now it's time for him to face the consequences." Over the next week, Sarah worked with frightening efficiency to cut off Daniel's access to everything. Emergency court orders froze all joint bank accounts. A restraining order prevented him from selling or transferring the house. Fraud alerts were placed on all credit in my name. The life insurance policy that named Daniel as my beneficiary was canceled. Within 5 days, Daniel's ability to continue his financial crime spree had been completely eliminated. "When he tries to access any of these accounts," Sarah explained, "he'll discover they've been frozen. That's when he'll know you've figured out his scheme. We need to be ready for his reaction." The confrontation was scheduled for the following Tuesday. Daniel would return from his weekly visit to Grandma to find me waiting with questions he couldn't answer and evidence he couldn't explain. Police would be positioned outside the house, ready to arrest him as soon as he confessed to his crimes on the wire I'd be wearing. "Remember," the detective coaching me explained, "don't accuse him directly at first. Ask questions that let him hang himself with his own lies. Get him to explain where he's really been going, what he's really been doing with your money. Let him dig his own grave." The night before the confrontation, I sat in my house. My house, as it turned out, since all the loans Daniel had taken against it were fraudulent, and tried to prepare myself for facing the man I'd married. Not the man I thought I'd married, who'd never actually existed, but the real Daniel. The con artist who'd seen me as nothing more than a bank account with benefits. I felt strangely calm. For months, I'd been living in a relationship that felt wrong without understanding why. Now I knew. Nothing had been real except the money he'd been stealing and the lies he'd been telling. Our marriage was a business transaction, and it was time to audit the books. Tuesday evening arrived with all the drama of a normal weeknight, which somehow made everything feel more surreal. I was wearing a wire to catch my husband confessing to multiple felonies, but I still had to remember to put the garbage out for pickup the next morning. There's something deeply weird about planning to destroy someone's life while also wondering if you have enough milk for coffee. The wire itself was disappointingly uncinematic, a small recording device taped to my ribs under my blouse, with a nearly invisible microphone clipped to my bra. The detective who'd helped me practice had assured me it was completely undetectable, though I felt like I was wearing a neon sign that flashed, "Police surveillance in progress." I'd spent the day acting as normally as possible, which was considerably more difficult than it sounds. How do you make small talk with someone when you know their entire life is a lie? How do you ask someone how their day was when you know they spent it visiting their pregnant girlfriend in prison? It's like trying to have a casual conversation with someone while knowing they're about to be struck by lightning. Daniel was supposed to be home by 8. At 8:15, I heard his key in the door, followed by the familiar sound of his weekend bag rolling across our entryway. He appeared in the kitchen doorway with the same slightly melancholy expression he always wore after visiting Grandma Helen, and for a moment, I almost felt sorry for him. His performance was so practiced, so convincing, that if I hadn't known better, I might have offered to make him tea and ask about his grandmother's condition. Instead, I smiled and asked the question that would begin the end of everything. "How's Grandma Helen doing?" "Not well, I'm afraid," Daniel said, settling into his usual chair at our kitchen table. "She had another episode yesterday. The doctors are talking about hospice care." It was fascinating, really, watching him lie with such conviction about a woman who'd been dead for 3 years. If lying were an Olympic sport, Daniel would have been a gold medalist. Unfortunately for him, I was no longer a member of his audience. "That's terrible," I said, pouring myself a glass of wine with hands that were steadier than I'd expected. "Which hospital is she at again?" Daniel paused for just a fraction of a second, the first crack in his performance. "She's not in the hospital right now. She wanted to go home to be more comfortable." "Of course," I said, taking a sip of wine. "It must be so hard driving back and forth to see her every weekend. Where does she live again?" Another pause, slightly longer this time. "About an hour north of here. Small town, you probably haven't heard of it." "Try me," I said pleasantly. "I love learning about new places." Daniel's smile became a little forced. "Millfield. It's really just a tiny farming community." Millfield was indeed north of the city, in completely the opposite direction from Greenville. Daniel was improvising now, and not particularly well. Con artists, apparently, don't handle unexpected interrogation with the same smooth confidence they bring to planned deceptions. "That's interesting," I said, reaching into the folder I'd placed on the counter, "because I did some research on Grandma Helen today." I placed the obituary on the table between us, watching Daniel's face as he read it. The change was remarkable. It was like watching someone's personality completely rearrange itself in real time. The concerned grandson disappeared, replaced by someone calculating and cold. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice flat. "Google," I said. "Amazing what you can find when you actually look for information instead of just accepting whatever you're told." Daniel stared at the obituary for a long moment, probably trying to figure out how much I knew and how he could spin this new development. "Emily," he said finally, "I can explain this." "Please do," I said, settling back in my chair. "I'm dying to hear how you explain visiting a dead woman every weekend for 6 months." "I've been visiting her grave," he said, which was actually creative enough that I almost admired it. "I know I should have told you she was gone, but I was still grieving. I couldn't bear to say the words out loud." "That's very touching," I said, pulling out the hotel receipts, "except it doesn't explain why you've been staying overnight at the Greenville Suites every weekend. Last I checked, cemeteries don't require overnight accommodations." This time, Daniel's pause was long enough to be uncomfortable. I could practically see him recalculating, trying to figure out what other evidence I might have and how much damage control he needed to do. "The hotel is for my own comfort," he said. "Visiting her grave is emotionally exhausting. I needed somewhere to process my grief." "In Greenville," I said, "which is 2 hours southeast of here, in the opposite direction from where you told me she lived." "I was confused about the directions," Daniel said, but his voice was losing confidence. "You know how bad I am with geography." This was true. Daniel couldn't find his way out of a paper bag with a map and a compass. But it was also irrelevant, since he'd been making the same trip every weekend for 6 months. "Here's the thing, Daniel," I said, pulling out the prison visitation forms. "I don't think you've been visiting a cemetery at all. I think you've been visiting the Greenville Women's Correctional Facility." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the refrigerator humming. Daniel stared at the visitation forms like they were written in a foreign language, though the dates and his signature were perfectly clear. "Where did you get these?" he asked, and for the first time he sounded genuinely shaken. "Does it matter?" I said. "The question is, who is Vanessa Chen, and why have you been visiting her every weekend while telling me you were caring for your dying grandmother?" Daniel's mask was completely gone now. The concerned husband, the grieving grandson, the loving partner, all of it had disappeared, leaving behind someone I didn't recognize, someone cold and calculating and dangerous. "You went through my private things," he said, his voice taking on an edge that made me grateful the police were positioned outside. "You had no right to violate my privacy like that." It was fascinating how quickly he'd shifted from trying to explain away the evidence to making me the villain for discovering it. Classic abuser tactics. When caught in a lie, attack the person who exposed the truth. "My privacy was violated the moment you started stealing my money to support your girlfriend," I said, pulling out the bank statements. "Did you really think I wouldn't notice $85,000 disappearing from my accounts?" "That money was for family expenses," Daniel said, but he was grasping at straws now. "Married couples share financial resources." "Family expenses," I repeated. "Like $2,000 a month deposited into your prison girlfriend's commissary account?" I placed the transfer receipts on the table, watching Daniel realize that his careful financial shell game had been completely exposed. Every deposit, every transfer, every stolen dollar was documented. "She's not my girlfriend," Daniel said, which was technically true since Vanessa was significantly more than that. "She's a friend who needed help." "A friend," I said, pulling out the love letters. "Let me read you something your friend wrote. I can't wait to be Mrs. Daniel Park. I can't wait to give you the children we've always talked about." Daniel's face went completely white. The letters were his most damning evidence. Proof that this wasn't a casual friendship or even a simple affair. This was a long-term relationship, a commitment that predated our marriage and was intended to continue long after I'd been discarded. "Emily," he said, and for the first time he sounded genuinely desperate. "You don't understand. It's complicated." "Then uncomplicate it for me," I said. "Tell me about Vanessa. Tell me about your relationship with her. Tell me the truth for once in your miserable life." And that's when Daniel made the mistake that would send him to prison. Instead of continuing to lie, instead of making up another elaborate story, he told me exactly what I needed to hear. "Fine," he said, his voice cold with fury. "You want the truth? Vanessa is the love of my life. She's the woman I should have married, the woman I would have married if she hadn't been convicted of a crime she didn't deserve to be punished for." I felt a chill run down my spine, not because of what he was saying, but because of how he was saying it. The mask was completely off now, and what was underneath was genuinely frightening. "She made some mistakes," Daniel continued, "but she was just trying to survive in a world that had abandoned her. Those people she took money from, they were rich, privileged, living off inherited wealth they'd done nothing to earn. Vanessa was leveling the playing field. He was defending a woman who'd systematically defrauded elderly victims, describing theft as social justice. This wasn't just criminal behavior. This was a complete lack of moral compass. And me? I asked. Where do I fit into this touching love story? Daniel looked at me with something that might have been pity if it hadn't been so cold. "You were convenient," he said. "A solution to a financial problem. Vanessa needed money for appeals, for living expenses, for our future together. You had money and you were naive enough to give it to me." "So you married me for my assets," I said, wanting him to say it clearly, wanting it recorded beyond any possible doubt. "I married you because I needed a source of income," Daniel said with brutal honesty. "You were financially stable, professionally successful, and most importantly, trusting enough to believe whatever I told you. You were the perfect mark." The perfect mark. There it was, recorded for posterity. I wasn't his wife. I was his victim, carefully selected and methodically exploited. "And when Vanessa gets out of prison?" I asked. "Then we start our real life together," Daniel said. "The life we always planned to have before she was railroaded by a corrupt justice system." "With the baby you made together," I said, pulling out the fertility clinic authorization. "The baby you created while I was losing our child alone in a hospital." For the first time since the conversation began, Daniel looked genuinely uncomfortable. The fertility clinic documents were perhaps his cruelest betrayal. Evidence that he'd literally been creating a new life with another woman while I grieved the loss of our pregnancy. "That was different," he said. "That was about our future, about the family Vanessa and I always wanted." "On March 15th, I said, reading the date from the authorization form, "the same day I miscarried. You couldn't come to the hospital because you were at the prison fertility clinic." "The timing was unfortunate," Daniel said, as if this were a minor scheduling conflict rather than proof of breathtaking cruelty. "Unfortunate," I repeated. "That's what you call abandoning your wife during a miscarriage so you could make a baby with your girlfriend." "You would have been fine regardless," Daniel said with stunning callousness. "Miscarriages happen. There was nothing I could have done to change that." His complete lack of empathy was more shocking than his criminal behavior. This wasn't just someone who'd stolen money. This was someone who was fundamentally incapable of human connection. "Did you ever feel anything real for me?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "You were useful," Daniel said. "That's all you ever were." And there it was, the confession I needed, recorded in high definition. I was useful, not loved, not valued, not even respected. Just useful, like a credit card or a bank account or any other financial resource to be exploited and discarded. I reached under my blouse and pulled out the wire, placing it on the table between us. Daniel stared at it like it was a poisonous snake. "Everything you just said was recorded," I told him. "Every confession, every admission, every cruel detail of your elaborate con game." The expression on Daniel's face was pure panic. The look of someone who just realized they'd walked into a trap of their own making. "You can't use that," he said desperately. "Recording someone without their consent is illegal." "Actually," I said, "recording conversations in your own home when you have reasonable suspicion of criminal activity is perfectly legal. I checked with my lawyer." "Your lawyer?" Daniel's voice cracked. "Sarah Kim," I said. "She specializes in financial fraud cases. She says what you've done to me represents multiple felonies with potential sentences totaling 15 to 20 years. Daniel lunged toward the wire, probably thinking he could destroy the evidence, but I was already moving toward the living room window. I waved to the detective positioned outside, then stepped back as Daniel realized what was happening. "You called the police," he said, and it wasn't a question. "I called everyone," I said. "Police, lawyers, bank fraud investigators. Turns out there are a lot of people who take a very dim view of con artists who steal hundreds of thousands of dollars from their victims." The front door opened and Detective Johnson walked in, followed by 2 uniformed officers. "Daniel Park," the detective said, "you're under arrest for identity theft, wire fraud, grand larceny, and financial exploitation." Daniel's arrest was surprisingly anticlimactic. No dramatic chase scene, no desperate attempts to escape. Just a man in handcuffs being read his rights while his victim watched from the couch. The most exciting part was when Daniel tried to claim that I'd entrapped him, which earned him an eye roll from Detective Johnson. "Sir," the detective said with professional patience, "confessing to multiple felonies because your wife asked direct questions about your behavior isn't entrapment. It's just really poor judgment." As they led Daniel toward the door, he turned back to me with an expression of pure hatred. "This isn't over," he said. "You have no idea what you've done." "I know exactly what I've done," I replied. "I've stopped being your victim." The house felt different after Daniel was gone, lighter somehow, as if the oppressive presence had been lifted. I sat in my living room, still wearing the wire, and tried to process what had just happened. 6 months of lies had been exposed in less than an hour. A marriage that had never been real was finally, officially over. Detective Johnson returned an hour later to collect the wire and get my formal statement. "How are you holding up?" he asked. "Better than expected," I said, and realized it was true. "I feel like I've been living in a fog for months, and it's finally lifted." "The arraignment is tomorrow morning," he said. "His bail will probably be set pretty high, given the flight risk and the amount of money involved." "Will he make bail?" I asked. Detective Johnson smiled grimly. "That's going to be difficult considering all his available assets have been frozen by court order. Turns out, when you steal someone's money, you can't use that same money to post bail." The irony was perfect. Daniel was trapped by his own greed, unable to buy his way out of jail because the money he'd stolen was no longer accessible. He'd created his own prison long before he'd been arrested. The next few weeks passed in a blur of legal proceedings, media attention, and paperwork. Daniel's story hit the local news with the headline, "Attorney Arrested for Defrauding Wife to Fund Prison Girlfriend's Baby," which was both accurate and devastating to what remained of his reputation. His law firm fired him immediately, the State Bar Association opened an investigation, and his former clients began requesting reviews of their cases. Meanwhile, Vanessa learned about Daniel's arrest through the prison grapevine, which apparently operates more efficiently than most news organizations. According to Detective Johnson, who'd spoken with prison officials, Vanessa's reaction was swift and decisive. She sent Daniel a letter telling him he was an idiot who'd ruined everything, refused all his phone calls, and removed him from her visitor list. The woman Daniel had destroyed his life for abandoned him the moment he could no longer be useful to her. It was poetic justice so perfect it almost seemed scripted. Daniel's public defender advised him to take a plea deal rather than risk trial, where the evidence against him was overwhelming and the potential sentences were severe. He agreed to plead guilty to 7 felony counts in exchange for a sentence of 7 years in state prison and full restitution of the stolen money. The plea hearing was the last time I saw Daniel in person. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by the orange jumpsuit and the realization that his elaborate schemes had collapsed around him. When the judge asked if he had anything to say before sentencing, Daniel looked directly at me. "I'm sorry," he said, though whether he was sorry for what he'd done or sorry he'd been caught was unclear. "No, you're not," I replied, loud enough for the entire courtroom to hear. "You're sorry you lost." The civil proceedings moved more quickly than I'd expected. Sarah Kim filed suit for damages, and Daniel's assets, what few legitimate assets he actually had, were seized to begin paying restitution. His 401k, his pension, his half of our marital property, even his law school graduation ring were liquidated to pay back what he'd stolen. The court awarded me full restitution plus interest, compensatory damages for emotional distress, punitive damages, and attorney's fees. The total judgment was over $600,000, though Sarah warned me it might take years to collect everything. The good news, she said, is that we've set up wage garnishment for the rest of his natural life. Every penny he earns after he gets out of prison will go toward paying you back. It was a satisfying prospect, Daniel spending the rest of his life working to repay the woman he'd tried to destroy. 3 months after Daniel's sentencing, Vanessa gave birth in prison to the baby they'd planned together. The child was immediately placed in state custody, since neither parent was in a position to provide care. Within 6 months, the baby had been adopted by a family who could give her the stable, loving home she deserved. The baby Daniel and Vanessa had schemed for was lost to both of them forever. Their carefully planned future had been destroyed by their own greed and Daniel's spectacular incompetence as a criminal. A year after Daniel's arrest, I sold our house and used the proceeds to buy a smaller, modern condo that held no memories of lies or betrayal. I'd been offered a promotion at work, a position in Singapore that would let me start fresh in a new country, with new experiences and new possibilities. On my last day in the old house, I found myself standing in Daniel's former office, looking at the empty space where his desk had been. For months, this room had been the center of his deception, the place where he'd planned my financial destruction while pretending to be my loving husband. Now it was just an empty room, waiting for new owners who would hopefully use it for more honest purposes. I thought about the woman I'd been a year ago, naive, trusting, financially secure but emotionally vulnerable. She'd believed in fairy tale romances and whirlwind courtships. She'd thought that love meant never questioning someone's motives or protecting your own interests. That woman was gone, replaced by someone harder but infinitely wiser, someone who knew the difference between love and manipulation, between partnership and exploitation, someone who understood that trust should be earned, not freely given to charming strangers with perfect dating profiles. As I locked the door of that house for the last time, I felt nothing but relief. Daniel had thought he was destroying me, but he'd actually done me a favor. He'd shown me exactly how strong I was, how much I could survive, how resilient I could be when everything I'd believed about my life turned out to be a lie. I thought he'd broken me. Instead, he'd just revealed how unbreakable I actually was. And that, more than any legal victory or financial settlement, was the real ending to our story. Daniel was serving 7 years in prison, alone and abandoned by everyone he'd claimed to love. Vanessa was living in a halfway house, working minimum wage, her dreams of wealth and status destroyed by her own criminal choices. And me? I was moving to Singapore, starting over at 33 with a successful career, hard-won wisdom, and the absolute certainty that I would never again be anyone's perfect mark. Some people deserve to be forgotten. Daniel Park was definitely one of them.